Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get going. I know we have a very limited time, and I'm grateful to have you guys with me on such an important topic and an important event in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act. My name is Shammi Carr. I'm an advocate at the Disability Rights Center of the Virgin Islands, and I am physically in the Virgin Islands. I'll talk briefly about what we do, and I also want to make sure that I briefly talk about what my background is, just so you know that this is something that I could talk about every day, all the day, probably just like you guys. So what I want to do is pull up the PowerPoint. So give me 1 second. I'm going to pull that up and we will get started. All right. Can everybody see my screen? If someone can let me know. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. So I'm hoping most of you have heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm going to absolutely assume most of you have, but maybe not as an extensive background as someone like myself, and I'll tell you why, but also in the sense of not just the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also talking about another very important issue for workforce specialists, and that's being duly enrolled in both public workforce systems. So we'll talk about that. Of the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what we want to do, the intent of this training and all that we do is to make the place more accessible. And in this case, we're talking about the workforce, making it more accessible. Now, I know you guys will probably laugh, but we have a cruise ship in and it's disturbing our internet a little bit. So if it's, there we go. Okay, so sorry for the lag with that. That's why I have to turn off my camera, a little bit more with bandwidth. So the Disability Rights Center of the Virgin Islands is the only territory-wide advocacy organization established by Congress. Sadly to say, Congress passed a bill recently that actually has our funding on the chopping block, so that's very upsetting for us. DRCVI was created back in 1977, and if we had time, I could go into how we became, why we became into existences, and you can research this, having to do with the Willowbrook Institute Developmental Center in Staten Island. And because of that situation, created the Protection and Advocacy Network, which we have 57 centers throughout the country and territories. I'm hoping you've heard of the PNAs. I'm hoping you access the PNAs. And I myself, I'm an advocate. I'm not an attorney. Even though I do know a lot of laws, I know in terms of the practice of the law, and my specialty or my forte is employment and disability. So with that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself as I lead into the Northeast ADA Center, just so you know who your presenter is for today. As I mentioned, I am the employment advocate, and I was specifically a workforce specialist in upstate New York. I worked at a one-stop, a very small one in Tompkins County, if anybody's from New York. And that initiative, which is called the Disability Employment Initiative, which was a collaboration or partnership between U.S. Department of Labor and Social Security Administration. And every state and territory, or almost every territory, had a DEI initiative. Some had multiple rounds like New York State. So again, I'm hoping you've heard of that, because that provided a lot of support, but also a lot of practice on how you streamline job seekers with disabilities that come through the one stop. And I did that for almost 6 years. And again, there was a mandate to be physically placed. You had to be placed in the workforce. So that made me understand things like ITS and the whole case management system, and understanding about blending and braiding, and understanding of different partnerships under the one stop. So I was knee deep in it, and I'm very grateful for that experience, because it really taught me a lot. Of course, not only just being a workforce specialist, but more importantly for myself, is to how to incorporate job seekers with disabilities within the context of the one stop. I also was a staffing specialist, helping to recruit people with disabilities for Cornell University. I was a ticket to work coordinator and a benefits advisor, both working with Social Security recipients, whether they have SSDI or SSI. And just so you know, folks who you may be serving, or you know, people who have Social Security benefits due to disability, there is a great program called Ticket to Work. And I also worked at the ADA Center, which brings me now to this slide. There are 10 ADA centers throughout the country. Again, I'm hoping you know about these. And if you don't, all these networks are in your favor to help get information referrals, resources, materials, whatever you may need, and they're all, of course, free. So when I worked at the ADA Center, I learned all of the ADA, of course, but Title I is probably my specialty, and also Title II. And we're going to talk more about Title II today because the workforce actually falls under Title II. Okay. And oddly enough, I'll be doing Department of Labor workforce training in August. And then our agency will be involved with the governor's workforce summit in September. And then, of course, October takes us to the National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So the next 3 months, we'll be busy with lots of workforce and disability activities. So I'm going to briefly just talk about the ADA because, again, the purpose is to bring awareness and also to celebrate the ADA and the importance of it. And we'll definitely talk about current trends in the public workforce related to job seekers with disabilities. And I'm going to talk to you about different resources that you can use with your job seekers. And I'll definitely leave a few minutes so there'll be time for Q&A as well. Again, I know this is a short presentation. We're going to try to pack a lot into it so that you can get the most out of it. So in terms of the ADA, I think most people know historically that people with disabilities were always not in a very positive light, whether it was sterilization, whether it was eugenics, whether it was institutionalization. And so historically, and I want to bring this up specifically because this is where the word handicap comes from. The word hand and cap means that people with disabilities were on the streets with their cap in their hand. And that's how the word was created or derived, handicap. That is a word we do not use anymore. It's considered a derogatory word, and what people want to be called is people with disabilities or people with this whatever condition they may have. But handicap, you will hear that. Try to correct people. I work with students as well, young students, and I tell them they're the teacher now. We're all the teachers to make sure that we can eradicate some of these stigmatizing words so that we can move forward with a more progressive agenda for people with disabilities. As you know, the civil rights movement was very heavy in the 60s, but the 1964 Act actually did not include people with disabilities. They were not a protected class. And so it wasn't until actually the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that started to address specifically the protected class of people with disabilities. And of course, we know in 1990, and just so you know, July 26th, this Saturday, please post, share, go on social media, and celebrate the ADA because it will be the 35th anniversary, which is considered a milestone anniversary. And I just want to mention in terms of the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, the Amendments Act was updated, the ADA was updated because the congressional intent of definition of disability was getting lost. So people were going to court, but people were not able to even get past definition of disability. So that was addressed. And you may hear something called mitigating measures, which is basically something you do to make your disability better. And it helped to make sure that folks, for example, who have epilepsy, if they take medication, they're still considered a person with a disability, even using a mitigating measure, even though their disability may not manifest, they were still considered. And again, that brought back the congressional intent and purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act and who to protect as well. So as you can see with this slide, with George H.W. Bush, who was the author or the signing of the ADA. And to the left, he's got a blue shirt on and glasses. That is actually I believe the chairman of the EEOC. And I think it's very fascinating that people with disabilities made ADA Title I, the first section, employment, and then the chairman of the EEOC was there. So it's very powerful to have that visual. And to the right is a man, you can kind of see him, he's got a hat on. He's considered the father or grandfather of the ADA, and his name is Justin Dart. In America, we have around 60 to 7 million people with disabilities. That is a lot of folks with disabilities. And I tell people also that turns out to be the largest voting bloc as well. And that's very important to know because people with disabilities are the ones who've championed to make all these laws, and including parents with disabilities in terms of special education law. So there's a large number, and it fluctuates certainly in the Virgin Islands, in the You know, we have certain cultural differences, and there's also different types of stigma that is still connected to disability. So many a times people will not talk about it. There's shame. And that's not just true in the Virgin Islands. That could be true certainly across the country and across the world. But that's why that 60 to 70 million Americans, that's based, of course, on US Census 2020. And take that with a very grain of salt, only because my guess is probably there's at least a third more, but at least documented in for demographic purposes, that's the number we're at. So as I mentioned, the 5 titles, we'll get right into it with the ADA. Title I, of course, having to do with employment. And as I mentioned to you, that the commissioner of EEOC was there for the signing of the ADA, but also people with disabilities said, we're sick and tired of being discriminated. We're sick and tired of not having equal access to work and making a living. Therefore, we cannot pursue the American dream. And that's why it is the first title of the ADA. The second title having to do with state and local governments, and this does include whether you call it the One Stop, American Job Center, and in conjunction, of course, with the Department of Labor, that this is a title where, again, Department of Justice enforces and making sure that programs and services are accessible, but also can be reasonably modified if need be to accommodate. And that's different language from Title I, because Title I is reasonable accommodation, but Title II is reasonable modification. And also Title II has a predecessor with the Rehab Act, because most of all of these entities receive federal funding or are federal funding in this case. And so this is nothing really new to them in terms of having accessible programs and services. But the reason that the ADA is considered the most comprehensive civil rights law for people with disabilities is because it addresses every single part of their life, including, of course, civic services, civic duties, and civic enjoyments as well. Title III is places of public accommodations. And I think most people know, you know, your typical, you know, your brick and mortar and your restaurants and your hotels and all that. But don't forget also, we consider e-commerce, online shopping, all of that actually is considered places of public accommodation. And I think it was a year or 2 years ago, I looked up how many court cases were in the pipeline for e-commerce and ADA Title III, and there was over 2,000. So that lets you know that the brick and mortar is not the only state place of public accommodation, but Department of Justice has taken up some of those cases. You can go on their, it's ada.gov. You can go on their website and look at their settlement agreements and see some of those places that are considered e-commerce and otherwise. Title IV is for telecommunications, and this is where the Federal Communication Commission comes in. I myself am absolutely blown away every time I go on their website, because they are completely up to date. The technology, back in the days, it was more like TTYs and closed captioning, and things are very different now. We have smartphones and apps and all sorts of things, and the FCC has done a great job. If you go on their disability page, and again, addressing every aspect of someone's life, including communication. And then Title IV is just a miscellaneous with things like retaliation, state rights, and attorney fees. Okay, so that's just the structure of the ADA. Now, who's a person with a disability? This comes into play because of how people disclose. So let's first talk about who is a person. A person with disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that limits a major life activity. And that's usually the one that most people fall under in terms of qualifying under the ADA. Do know that for Title I, you have to meet that definition, and you have to meet the second part of the definition, which is qualifies for the position. You may hear certain people talking all the time saying, well, they're getting a job on merit. That is absolutely not true. With any of the civil rights law, with including the ADA, you must meet the merit of the job. So when people say that, it's inflammatory, it's gaslighting. And I want to be very clear, that is not how that works. They have to qualify for the job. And of course, life activities include walking and breathing and the typical things you think of, but there's also things you may not think of, like reproduction. That is considered a major life activity. And that actually came up because of HIV/AIDS. So the ADA is not does not have an exhaustive list of disabilities or conditions, because in this case, as I just mentioned, with reproduction, it is changing, or at least the interpretation can be changed depending what that life activity is and how it gets implicated in terms of affecting a major life activity. So I just wanted to give you that example. Most disabilities are non-obvious. That's why the workforce, it's incredibly important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, to make sure that people with obvious disabilities, you can still ask them if they need any reasonable modifications at the workforce, but there are folks without. And sometimes when I was a workforce specialist, I've also been a job instructor with a welfare program called Jobs Plus. And most of the time, people were not disclosing. So I would ask them a few questions and then I'd get some information. I'm going to teach you that little trick I use, because I know just like that program I did with Job Plus, workforce is similar, where it's self-attesting. And we have to be able to draw from that in terms of what their needs might be without them being uncomfortable to disclose. So most disabilities are non-obvious or invisible. And for temporary disabilities, most of you from the states have a human rights state level law, which covers temporary disabilities, but ADA does not. So that's just a difference between federal and state. We, unfortunately, the Virgin Islands don't have that. So not every state or territory has one. I know New York State certainly has one, and temporary disabilities are certainly protected. All right. I'm not going to actually go over this, but I want you to have this, and I want to point out just one thing, and that's number 3. Reasonable accommodations on the average cost $500. More than half have no cost associated, which means basically it's $500 or less. And a lot of accommodations don't even have any cost. And so when you're talking to a job seeker and they're talking about reasonable accommodation, and because that's one of the misnomers and stereotypes and fears of employers, is that if I hire this person, they're going to cost me 3 arms and 4 legs. And that's just not the case. Okay. It's not as expensive as you think. It's actually far less expensive. And at times, like I said, no cost at all. So that's very important when you're working with someone with disability. They know how to advocate for that. And they know that because that can help counteract some of the problems that employers and the communication that they have about reasonable accommodation. Okay. So let's talk about this. This is probably one of the most important slides, because when you're with a job seeker, and the one that I worked at, it was self-attesting. So if the person said they didn't have a disability, they didn't have a disability. But you could see through sometimes the conversations, some of the historical things they're saying, or maybe how they're writing, whatever it may be, you suspect something is going on. And when we say suspect, it just means I want to be able to help just in case you have a need. That's what I mean by suspect. So how do you inquire? If you, as a staff, suspect a job seeker has a disability and they don't disclose in the intake because it is self-disclosure, here are some questions you can ask. Now, do remember, bottom line, and that's why I put it in bold and underline, you can ask a job seeker directly if they have a disability. It is for programmatic purpose. That's very different from an employer. Okay, they have very different rules. So I think a lot of folks think in the workforce they can't ask that. Yes, you can. You absolutely can ask that. And it might be a good practice to ask every single person that comes in, with the caveat that I'm asking you this question. I'm asking everybody the same question. And I want to make sure if you have a disability that we accommodate you. Okay. That doesn't sound like you're being suspicious, you're being meddling. You know, it sounds like a professional way to address any barriers that someone might have, in this case, disability. So you can directly ask them, or you can ask them some other ways. Did you ever have extra help at school? I've asked this question numerous times, and people say, yeah, I got a little resource time. Yeah, I was in special ed for a while. That lets you know that they probably have a disability or had a disability. Okay, there's actually 2 more parts of the definition of disability, which I didn't address because the first one is usually the one that has the most leverage or usage of it. but there is part of it that says has a record of a disability. So if you've been in special education, that's considered a record of a disability. If you've gone to rehabilitation for substance abuse and you've recovered, that is a record of a disability. If you've had cancer and you are now in remission, that is a record of a disability. So that's how that falls into play. And then the other one is regarded as. Someone might regard you as a person with a disability. So you can go back to that slide. But really the one that's most used is the first one, which is how it affects a mental or physical impairment. You can also ask, are you taking any medication that affects your ability to work? Now, this can be very applicable because you have a situation where you're helping someone get a job. What if they have to take a drug test? Okay. Now, the drug tests are not prohibited by ADA, so employers absolutely can do drug testing. What people with disabilities need to know, and this is where this question comes in, is that if they say, yes, I do take medication, and they're applying for something, let's just say something with construction, then you're going to want to know, okay, so maybe does your medication relate to a disability? Because if so, I want to make sure I can help you, or I can find someone to help you navigate drug testing and your prescription medication. So that's another one. And that gets a little complicated. And that's why I say, you can, and I'm going to give you resources. You've got 3 resources for free that you can call and get information. And you can also give these numbers to the job seekers that you're working with as well. Because like I said, some of these get very tricky. So are you taking any medications? And if someone says, yes, I take XYZ, and they want to be a truck driver, you might want to steer them in a different direction, literally, because there's no accommodations for some medications when you're doing truck driving. It might be related to your disability, it might be justified, but it's still a problem in that industry. So that's another example of like, if you're taking medication with this, it might not be the best. Let's look at another career, something that's not going to affect your medication issue. Okay. And then, do you have any conditions that, can be a barrier for working? And people will talk. People will say, well, yes, I've dealt with this. And I remember one person telling me it's a combination of 2 and 3. She said, oh, no, I don't have a disability, but I've been taking medication for 20 years. And I'm like, oh, okay. To me, that sounds like a person who would qualify. And she has some conditions that were a barrier for working. But once we talked about how she is a person with a disability, then we could get past that and then talk about those barriers, and then, of course, reasonable accommodation. So these are questions you can ask. And when we finish and when we got a couple minutes, please do ask what kind of questions or context that you deal with when it comes to disclosure, and maybe some concerns that job seekers have, like, why are you asking me? I'd be happy to answer them or find information. Like I said, because I feel like this is probably the most important slide. All right. Now, let's also talk about another issue, which has to do with referring to VR. And I see I'm already running out of time. I'm going to do this slide, and I'm going to do the resource slide, and then I'm going to take questions. So when do you make a referral? Because we found all the time that someone says they have a disability at the intake, automatic referral to VR. That's not the way to do it. That's not the way to do it. You both public workforce systems gets checkpoints, gets A pluses, gets credit when the person gets a job. So VR gets credit and you get credit. So don't get rid of them. Don't refer them out, because at the end of the day, they might be getting peripheral services with you, getting their more intensive services with VR. But at the end of the day, when the person gets a job, they're the first winners. But guess what? The 2 public workforce can also win with them. So keep that in mind. That's another big issue I see when workforce specialists are referring people out before they even give them a chance to, see if their services can work as well for them, or in conjunction, of course. So when you make a referral, when they need reasonable accommodation that has cost, your VR system in every state can potentially help to pay for reasonable accommodation or co-share costs with employer. So this is very important, and it can make or break a situation, because you may have someone who has a visual disability and they need software, and that software costs $2,000, and VR says, well, we'll pay half. the employer says, okay, we'll pay the other half. And then all of a sudden the person is continuing to work and everybody wins. So it's very important. Also, if they need interpreting service, assistive technologies, I mentioned the software, anything that has a heavy cost, whether it's for trainings and for work, that's a good time to make a referral as well, because of course WIOA and the workforce does not have a pot of money for reasonable accommodations for work. But you do have some monies or some resources from reasonable modification for your own services. Okay. And when it's deemed the job seeker is not ready for work, VR can do vocational assessments related to disability, but don't fall into the stereotypes or pigeonholing, because VR actually has extensive amount of assessments, evaluations, surveys. They're able to help someone. It's called work tryout, and they're able to take a person with disability in several settings and see what kind of work they can do. So maybe you refer them to VR, and then when they do find the right type of work they can do, then they can work with you again. But let VR do that's their specialty, and that's something that would be very appropriate to make a referral to VR. Okay. So with that, I'm going to jump right to, and I'm sorry we didn't get to the current trends, but the resources I want you to definitely know about: Office of Disability Employment Policy. It's basically the Department of Labor's disability page. I know some of you know of the LEAD Center, which is part of ODEP. Now there's a manual called Job Access Resource Guide. And if you can't click it and get it, do email me and I'll put the email in my chat. Or maybe, Nicole, if you could put my email in the chat, that would be great. And I can give that to you at the end. And then I can always follow up and send you the actual document. It's called Access for All. It was created out of University of Massachusetts, the Institute for Community Inclusion. It is the absolute best resource, in my opinion. If you have that resource only, you don't need any other resource when it comes to disability and workforce. It's that amazing. It's that comprehensive. Want to make sure you know about Ask Jan. I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, know about them. They've got over 80 brochures on different disability and accommodations. A great way to do that is to give them the brochure. They can call Jan, they can call the Northeast ADA Center, they can call myself. I'm available as well. I do service the Virgin Islands, but I'm always happy to talk to anybody, anywhere about employment and disability. This is our contact information. I'm going to stop in the last minute or two we have and take any questions that you may have.
I have a question.
Yes.
Who were the other two people in the photo with President Bush and Mr. Dart?
You know, I don't recall. I feel like one name was Sally, but I really don't remember. But that's easy to look up, and obviously that's a reverend. So
Mm-hmm.
these two, I don't know their names. I used to, I kind of forgotten. But it's
Mm-hmm.
easy to look up because you just look up ADA signature and the people that surrounded Bush. So
Thank you, because
yes,
I'm looking forward to posting that on social media on the 26th.
wonderful, wonderful. If you'd like, you can absolutely email me and I will follow up and give you that information. I have no problem with that. So
I would be happy to do that. Thank
okay,
you.
so why does everybody, I don't know how to, I'm going to stop the share only because I don't know how to type in. It's like chewing gum and walking at the same time. I can't do it. Okay. So this is my email. So if anybody needs a resource, has a question, would like to get a copy of the slides, absolutely, I will send that out. So please do email me so that I can get them right to you. I'll attach that document just because I'm already sending you an email. And on top of that, is it Debbie? Send me a separate email so that I can follow up specifically for you. And I can do that today, okay? All right, Ms. Young, go ahead.
So what do the recent or the cutbacks on the cutting block, the recent administration, how is that going to affect protected workers?
You mean workers with disabilities?
Yep, being one of those myself.
Yep.
I mean, I have a great employer, but I work with people trying to get them jobs, and they come in and they see my service animal and they think, oh, well, if you can do it, I can do it.
Mhm.
But with changes in the administration, that tends to get a little trickier.
120%. You know, I'm as an advocate for people with disabilities, as a woman of color, like I have a lot of problems with this whole DEI situation. And I think on one hand, the EEOC will stand strong to continue to protect who they're supposed to protect. I can connect you with my contact at EEOC, Miss Allen. She's wonderful to talk to. She's the outreach for the federal EEOC out of Miami. And, this is a question that people should be concerned because there's also, I don't want to say language, but things that I'm hearing, like we can hire whoever we want. We can have whatever kind of people working for us now. I really don't believe that is the true sentiment of the EEOC. There's still an EEOC, but you could always call the federal EEOC. You could always connect with me and I can ask my contact with the EEOC, but it is a very unknown time. What I would say in the past is, obviously you're a protected class. I'm still going to say you're a protected class. So I do feel
Well,
like that's not going to go away.
I'm blessed because I have a great union that stands behind me and
Yep.
I have a great employer. But unfortunately, a lot of the folks that I get to go get into the employment field, they have neither. And it's getting harder to stand up for them when you know that they're being discriminated against because of an issue that they have.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm hoping next year, people who get elected to Congress will have a better view than what's going on now. So that's my hope. There was another hand up. I'm sorry if I didn't call you. But Miss, is it Valentine?
Yeah, thank you. I had two questions. One is I'm working with someone who has a disability, and he's concerned about getting paid less because of his disability. Do you have any advice around that? And then
Absolutely.
oh, sorry. And the second question is does type 1 diabetes fall under a disability? And then also type 2? I was just curious.
Let me answer that backwards. So type 1 and type 1 usually always qualifies just because it's congenital. Also, the fact that even though you might be taking insulin or some mitigating measure, remember I was talking about that person's still going to be qualified. So, and type 2, usually the same way. Again, what someone does is they read the definition and say, yes, that affects me this way. Yes, it affects, and different type of circulatory and endocrinology and all that kind of bodily functions, they all count too, certainly. Okay, so yes, diabetes more times than not do qualify. Now, you brought up a very good question because right now, as we speak, there was a sunset of 14C, I believe it's called, out of Department of Labor that was allowing some employers to pay people with disabilities less. They were called sheltered workshop or piecemeal rate. They were phasing that out, but it looks like they're not going to phase it out, which therefore means employers can go ahead now and pay people with disabilities less, pennies by the dollar, as they say. Now, if the person you're talking about is in competitive employment, they must pay that person at least minimum wage. Otherwise, they would fall under the 14C program, and they would know that because it's called like a sheltered workshop or aggregated or congregated work. So, no, technically they cannot pay you less. It's just like women. They can't pay women less with people with disabilities in the same boat.
Thank you.
Is it, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's Mr. or Miss Garcia, but
Hi, yes.
Miss Garcia, okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I didn't see IPS as a resource. It's an evidence-based practice to help people with disabilities secure employment. And I just wanted to share it with everyone. They actually do have trainings for people that serve uh, people with disabilities seeking employment. And it's a great tool to have. Because it focuses on competitive employment for people with disabilities.
Mhm. And you use the word right there, competitive integrated employment. That's the mantra that we use. And competitive, of course, mean paid at least minimum wage. Integrated, of course, being around people with disabilities. And employment is employment, not sheltered workshop. Okay, so thank you for bringing that up.
Yes.
I know we're over time, but I'm welcome to any more questions you may have as we close it out. Okay, so just for the sake of time, of respectful of your time, thank you. I'll go ahead and close it out. And one of the things I will tell you is that we are in a labor shortage. And people with disabilities are a great way to help fill that gap. So on the side that I'm advocating for job seekers with disabilities, I'm pushing them. For the employers, I'm engaging them. And the workforce specialists, I'm supporting them. Okay, so please know I'm here specifically to support, because I do all three. I work with all three groups extensively. And in the time of labor shortage, this is a time we need to have our people step up to the plate and be hired and be considered good candidates for positions. One thing I do, I just want to share this as a best practice, and you guys can definitely share this and do this, is I get choice employers out of the workforce business services who have openings, and we do a roundtable. It's a nice supplement to a job fair. And we just focus on recruiting people with disabilities. You can do a roundtable for recruitment of people with barriers. I've done that too. That includes people with less than high school diploma, convictions, displaced, unemployed. So I just want to share that with you. And we have it on our YouTube channel if you want to see any of our roundtables that we've done with employers. It's a great way to do recruitment. It's a great way to have employer engagement. Okay. And with that, I'll go ahead and close out. Again, my name is Shammi Carr, an advocate. I've been doing this for almost 15 years as an employment disability advocate, 25 in the field total. So this is very near and dear to my heart. And if you guys can celebrate the ADA this weekend, like you say, by posting, by sharing, and let folks know, your colleagues, of these resources that are available, please spread them.